Picture yourself walking through the scorching sand dunes of Giza at sunset, when the shadows of the Great Pyramids stretch like dark fingers across the desert floor. Hear the distant sound of drums echoing from deep within a hidden chamber. Beneath the Sphinx, as you approach, the air grows thick with the smoke of burning frankincense and something else. Something metallic and disturbing that makes your stomach turn. You descend stone steps worn smooth by 3,000 years of footsteps, each one taking you deeper into a world where gods walked among mortals, where pharaohs claimed divine right over every body in their kingdom, and where the line between religious ritual and sexual exploitation disappeared entirely. The flickering torchlight reveals hieroglyphs on the walls, not the sanitized versions you see in museums, but the original depictions that archaeologists quietly catalog and store away from public view. Images of pharaohs engaged in acts so disturbing that modern scholars debate whether they should even be discussed in academic circles. But tonight, in this hidden chamber deep beneath the desert sands, we're going to uncover the truth about what really happened in ancient Egypt when the sun went down and the palace doors closed. We're going to explore a civilization that created some of humanity's greatest architectural wonders, while simultaneously developing some of its most systematic and horrifying methods of sexual exploitation. You think you know ancient Egypt from the movies, the golden treasures, the mysterious mummies, the romantic stories of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But what if I told you that behind those golden masks and beneath those magnificent temples lay a sexual culture so disturbing, so systematically cruel, that it would make the most depraved Roman emperors seem restrained by comparison? It's the ancient Egyptians didn't just build monuments to their gods, they built an entire civilization around the concept that pharaohs were living deities with absolute power over every aspect of human existence, including the most intimate details of their subjects' bodies and sexuality. And they used that power in ways that would fundamentally change your understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other in the name of religion, politics, and divine authority. This isn't mythology or speculation. This is documented history, preserved in hieroglyphs, papyrus scrolls, and archaeological evidence that reveals a side of ancient Egypt that tour guides don't mention and history textbooks carefully avoid. By the time we're finished exploring these hidden chambers of Egyptian sexual culture, you'll understand why some archaeological discoveries remain locked away in museum storage rooms, and why certain ancient practices were so horrifying that they influenced sexual taboos and religious prohibitions for thousands of years after the pharaohs were gone. To understand the sexual practices of ancient Egypt, you need to understand that Egyptian society was built on a foundation of absolute inequality that made Roman slavery look almost benevolent by comparison. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler, he was literally considered a living god, the earthly incarnation of Horus, son of Ra, with divine authority over every aspect of life and death throughout his kingdom. This divine status meant that every person in Egypt, the highest noble to the lowest peasant, was essentially the pharaoh's property to do with as he pleased. But the sexual implications of this divine ownership were particularly horrifying for women and children, who existed in a legal system that gave them no rights, no protections, and no escape from whatever sexual demands the pharaoh or his representatives might make. The Egyptian concept of sexual slavery was fundamentally different from other ancient civilizations because it was deeply intertwined with religious belief. When a pharaoh claimed sexual access to any woman in his kingdom, he wasn't just exercising political power, he was performing a religious duty, ensuring that his divine essence was spread throughout the population to maintain cosmic order and guarantee the annual flooding of the Nile. Archaeological evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina, where the workers who built the royal tombs lived, reveals a complex system of sexual hierarchies that extended throughout Egyptian society. Women were classified into different categories based on their sexual availability to various levels of male authority. At the top were the pharaoh's wives and concubines, who lived in luxurious conditions but were essentially high-class prisoners. Below them were the temple prostitutes, who served both religious and sexual functions. At the bottom were the common slaves, who had no protection whatsoever from sexual exploitation. The papyrus records from the New Kingdom period particularly the reign of Ramesses II, contain detailed administrative documents that treat women's bodies like any other royal resource. These documents include inventories of available women, schedules for sexual services, and even breeding programs designed to produce children with specific characteristics that the pharaoh desired for his court or his armies. One of the most disturbing aspects of Egyptian sexual slavery was the practice of divine selection, where young girls from throughout the kingdom were brought to the pharaoh's court for his personal inspection and potential inclusion in his harem. This process, documented in texts from the time of Amenhotep III, involved systematic evaluation of girls as young as 10 years old, who were examined naked by court officials and rated on their physical attributes, their potential fertility, and their suitability for various sexual roles within the royal household. The girls selected for the royal harem underwent a year-long preparation process that was essentially systematic sexual conditioning designed to make them compliant and skilled in satisfying the pharaoh's desires. This training, conducted in special quarters within the palace complex, included instruction in sexual techniques, drug-induced conditioning to associate pleasure with submission, and psychological manipulation designed to break down any resistance to sexual demands. But the pharaoh's sexual authority extended far beyond his personal harem. Egyptian law gave him the right to claim any woman in his kingdom for sexual purposes, a practice known as royal requisition that could be applied to married women, temple priestesses, or even foreign ambassadors, wives and daughters. When these women were taken for royal use, their families were compensated with goods or money, making it clear that women were considered property to be bought, sold, and transferred at the pharaoh's whim. The documentation from the Amarna period, during the reign of Akhenaten, provides particularly detailed evidence of how this system operated in practice. Palace records show that the pharaoh maintained detailed catalogs of available women throughout his kingdom, organized by region, age, physical characteristics, and sexual experience. When he traveled through his territories, local officials were required to provide him with selections of women from these catalogs for his temporary use. Perhaps most horrifying was the Egyptian practice of generational cycling, where daughters of royal concubines were automatically added to the pharaoh's harem when they reached puberty, creating family lines that existed solely to provide sexual services to successive pharaohs. These women lived their entire lives within the palace complex, never experiencing freedom or forming relationships outside of their sexual servitude to the royal family. Deep within the temple complexes of ancient Egypt, behind chambers that archaeologists euphemistically describe as religious spaces, some of the most disturbing sexual rituals in human history were conducted in the name of ensuring Egypt's prosperity and the pharaoh's divine favor with the gods. These weren't occasional ceremonies, they were systematic, regularly scheduled events that combined religious observance with sexual exploitation on a scale that defies modern comprehension. The Egyptian calendar was filled with fertility festivals that required sexual participation from women who had no choice in the matter. The most notorious of these was the Festival of Min, the god of fertility and reproduction, celebrated during the harvest season, when the Nile's annual flood had receded and the land was ready for planting. During this festival, which lasted for several days, hundreds of women were required to participate in public sexual rituals designed to ensure the land's fertility for the coming year. Contemporary accounts from Greek visitors to Egypt describe scenes that were so shocking they could barely bring themselves to record them in detail. The historian Herodotus, who witnessed these festivals during the 5th century BC, wrote cryptically about ceremonies involving the union of mortals with divine essence that took place in the temple courtyards under the direct supervision of the pharaoh and his priests. What he couldn't bring himself to describe explicitly was the systematic rape of enslaved women who were considered offerings to the fertility gods. The Temple of Karnak contains relief carvings that provide more detailed evidence of these fertility rituals, though the most explicit images have been carefully chiseled away or covered by later pharaohs, who were apparently disturbed by their predecessors' practices. What remains visible shows processions of naked women being led by priests toward altars where they would be united with the divine essence of various gods. A euphemism for ritualized sexual assault performed in front of crowds of worshippers. But the most horrifying aspect of these fertility rituals was their systematic nature. Temple records from Deir show that women were specifically selected and prepared for these ceremonies based on their perceived fertility, their physical appearance, and their potential to produce children who would be raised as temple servants. Young women who had recently begun menstruating were considered particularly valuable for these rituals because their fertility was thought to be most pleasing to the gods. The preparation process for fertility rituals was itself a form of sexual torture. Women selected for participation were kept in special chambers within the temple complex for weeks before the ceremonies, during which they were subjected to forced feeding of aphrodisiac substances, systematic sexual conditioning by temple priests, and psychological indoctrination designed to convince them that their suffering was necessary for Egypt's survival. One of the most disturbing practices, documented in the Edwin Smith papyrus, was the ritual of divine conception, where women were repeatedly sexually assaulted by different men during fertility ceremonies in the belief that this would increase the chances of conception and produce children with divine protection. These children, if they survived, were considered sacred and were raised within the temple complex as future priests or temple servants, creating a permanent class of people whose entire existence was defined by their origin in ritualized sexual violence. The pharaoh himself was expected to participate personally in the most important fertility rituals, particularly those conducted during the Opet festival, and the god Amun was believed to renew his divine essence through sexual union with mortal women. During these ceremonies, the pharaoh would select women from throughout his kingdom to serve as representatives of various goddesses and engage in sexual acts with them that were witnessed by hundreds of priests and nobles as proof of his divine authority and his commitment to ensuring Egypt's prosperity. Archaeological evidence from the temple complex at Abydos reveals specialized chambers that were designed specifically for these fertility rituals, complete with drainage systems for bodily fluids, restraining devices carved into stone altars, viewing areas where witnesses could observe the ceremonies. The sophistication of these installations suggests that fertility rituals involving forced sexual participation were a regular and central part of Egyptian religious practice, not occasional aberrations. The psychological impact of these fertility rituals on the women forced to participate was documented in medical papyri from the New Kingdom period, which describe treatments for women suffering from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. These texts refer to conditions like temple sickness, characterized by persistent nightmares, inability to form relationships with men, and self-destructive behavior that sometimes led to suicide. The treatments prescribed by Egyptian physicians included further sexual conditioning and religious indoctrination, suggesting that the medical establishment was complicit in perpetuating the sexual abuse rather than treating its victims. Perhaps most disturbing was the Egyptian belief that women who died during or shortly after fertility rituals had achieved the highest possible spiritual state. Having given their lives to ensure divine favor for Egypt, these women were mummified and entombed with honors, usually reserved for nobility, creating a religious incentive for deadly sexual practices that treated women's lives as acceptable sacrifices for the supposed benefit of the kingdom. The royal harem of ancient Egypt was not the exotic paradise of popular imagination, but rather a sophisticated prison system designed to maintain absolute control over hundreds of women while maximizing their sexual and reproductive utility to the pharaoh and his court. Archaeological evidence from palace complexes like those at Memphis and Thebes reveals structures that were essentially luxury concentration camps, where women lived their entire lives under constant surveillance and were subjected to systematic sexual exploitation disguised as religious duty and royal privilege. The organization of Egyptian harems was based on a complex hierarchy that determined not only a woman's living conditions, but also the specific types of sexual services she was expected to provide. At the top of this hierarchy were the great royal wives, typically numbering between 3 and 7, who were the pharaoh's primary consorts and the mothers of potential heirs. These women enjoyed considerable luxury and political influence. But they were also subject to the most intense sexual demands and lived under constant threat of execution if they failed to produce male children, or if they were suspected of infidelity. Below the great royal wives were the royal wives of secondary rank, usually numbering in the dozens, who served specific sexual functions within the royal household. Some were designated as knight companions, whose primary role was to satisfy the pharaoh's sexual desires. Others were ceremonial wives who participated in religious rituals that required sexual activity. Still others were breeding wives, whose sole purpose was to produce as many children as possible, to increase the royal lineage and provide a pool of potential successors. The lowest tier of the harem hierarchy consisted of hundreds of concubines, slaves, and servants who were available for sexual use by the pharaoh, his sons, high-ranking court officials, and visiting dignitaries. These women had no legal status whatsoever and could be traded, given as gifts, or killed at will. Palace records from the reign of Ramesses III show that the royal harem contained over 1,200 women, making it one of the largest organized systems of sexual slavery in ancient history. The daily life within these harems was regulated by elaborate schedules that treated women's bodies like resources to be managed efficiently. Women were assigned specific times for bathing, grooming, meals, and sexual availability based on their rank in the hierarchy and the pharaoh's current preferences. The most desired women might be summoned to the royal chambers multiple times per day, while others might wait months, or even years for their turn to serve the pharaoh's sexual needs. Training within the harem was conducted by older women who had survived decades of sexual servitude and had learned to navigate the dangerous politics of royal favor. New arrivals, whether purchased as slaves or presented as tribute from conquered territories, underwent intensive conditioning designed to break their will and reshape them into compliant sexual servants. This training included instruction in Egyptian customs and language, sexual techniques that pleased the pharaoh and his court, and the complex etiquette that governed harem life. The psychological control systems used in Egyptian harems were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Women were encouraged to compete with each other for royal attention through elaborate beauty rituals, sexual performance, and demonstration of loyalty to the pharaoh. Those who gained favor received better living conditions, more elaborate clothing, and jewelry, and increased status within the harem hierarchy. Those who fell out of favor faced reduced rations, physical punishment, or in extreme cases, execution. Religious indoctrination played a crucial role in maintaining control over harem populations. Women were taught that serving the pharaoh sexually was a sacred duty that brought them closer to the gods and ensured their afterlife salvation. They participated in daily religious ceremonies that reinforced their subservient status and celebrated their sexual availability as offerings to divine authority. This religious framework made resistance seem not just futile but actually sinful, creating psychological barriers to rebellion that were often more effective than physical restraints. The medical care provided to harem women reveals nature of their sexual exploitation. Palace physicians developed specialized treatments for conditions related to frequent sexual activity, including remedies for sexually transmitted infections, procedures for treating injuries from violent men, sexual encounters, and contraceptive methods that allowed the pharaoh to control which women would become pregnant and when. These medical interventions were designed not to protect the women's health and well-being, but to maximize their sexual utility and reproductive potential. Economic records from the New Kingdom period showed that maintaining the royal harem was one of the largest expenses in the Egyptian royal budget, requiring vast resources for food, clothing, housing, medical care, and security. The cost was justified by the harem's multiple functions, providing sexual satisfaction to the pharaoh and his court, producing heirs to continue the royal lineage, serving as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, and demonstrating the pharaoh's wealth and power to visiting dignitaries. Women in the harem were literally treated as capital investments that needed to be maintained to preserve their value. The security measures used to control harem populations were extensive and brutal. The complexes were surrounded by high walls and guarded by eunuchs who had been castrated to ensure their loyalty and eliminate any possibility of sexual relationships with the confined women. Escape attempts were punishable by death, not just for the women involved, but often for their families as well, creating a system of collective punishment that discouraged resistance. Internal surveillance networks encouraged women to report on each other's behavior, fostering an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made organized rebellion nearly impossible. Perhaps most disturbing was the fate of harem women when a pharaoh died. While some might be inherited by his successor, many were considered too dangerous to be allowed to survive, as they possessed intimate knowledge of royal secrets and might pose a threat to the new ruler's authority. Archaeological evidence from royal tombs suggests that mass executions of harem women were common during dynastic transitions, with hundreds of women being killed and buried alongside their dead master to serve him in the afterlife. These women were often buried alive or killed by poison, methods that preserved their bodies from mummification while ensuring they couldn't reveal royal secrets to potential enemies. In the deepest chambers of Egyptian temples, where even today archaeologists work in hushed tones and museum curators store artifacts that are never displayed to the public, evidence exists of sexual practices so disturbing that they challenge our fundamental understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. These were not the fertility rituals we discussed earlier, which at least had the pretense of ensuring agricultural prosperity. These were sacrificial sexual rituals designed specifically to transfer spiritual power from human victims to the pharaoh and his priests through the systematic combination of sexual torture and ritualized murder. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in human history, contain encoded references to ceremonies called the Great Union of Death and Renewal, which were performed in hidden chambers beneath major temple complexes during the most important religious festivals. These texts, written in deliberately obscure language to hide their true meaning from unauthorized readers, describe rituals where human beings were subjected to prolonged sexual assault before being killed as offerings to ensure the pharaoh's continued divine power and Egypt's protection from cosmic chaos. Archaeological excavations at the temple complex of Saqqara have uncovered chambers that were clearly designed for these sacrificial rituals, complete with drainage channels carved into stone floors, restraining devices built into altar platforms, and elaborate ventilation systems that would have been necessary for ceremonies involving large numbers of participants over extended periods. The sophistication of these installations suggests that sacrificial sexual rituals were not occasional aberrations but regular, carefully planned events that required significant resources and preparation. The selection process for sacrificial victims was documented in administrative papyri from the Middle Kingdom period, which reveal a systematic approach to identifying individuals whose deaths would be most pleasing to the gods. Preference was given to young women and children who met specific physical criteria: virginity, unblemished skin, particular hair and eye colors that were associated with different deities. Foreign captives were especially prized for these rituals, because their suffering was believed to transfer the spiritual power of their entire peoples to Egypt. The ritual process itself, is described in the hidden chambers of the Temple of Deir, followed a precise sequence designed to maximize both the victim's suffering and the spiritual energy believed to be released through their death. Victims were first subjected to days of preparation involving forced consumption of psychoactive drugs that heightened their sensitivity to pain while preventing them from losing consciousness. This chemical conditioning ensured that they would remain aware and responsive throughout the ordeal that followed. The sexual component of these sacrificial rituals was based on the Egyptian belief that spiritual essence could be extracted from human beings through intense physical and emotional trauma, sexual assault being considered the most effective method for accessing this essence. Victims were subjected to prolonged sexual torture by multiple participants, including priests, nobles, and specially selected slaves who had been trained in techniques designed to maximize suffering while preventing death until the appropriate ritual moment. Contemporary accounts from Persian and Greek sources describe witnessing these ceremonies during diplomatic visits to Egypt. though their descriptions are often couched in language so euphemistic that their true meaning only becomes clear when compared with archaeological evidence. The historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC, referred to sacred marriages that ended in divine transformation, while Plutarch describes ceremonies where mortals achieved unity with the gods through ultimate sacrifice. The climax of these sacrificial sexual rituals involved the ritual murder of victims at the moment of sexual assault, usually through strangulation or the use of ceremonial knives designed to inflict maximum pain while ensuring a slow death. The timing of the killing was crucial to the ritual's effectiveness, as it was believed that the combination of sexual stimulation and mortal terror produced the highest quality spiritual essence for harvesting. By the participating priests and nobles. The bodies of sacrificial victims were not simply disposed of after these ceremonies, but were subjected to additional ritual processing designed to extract every possible benefit from their deaths. Hearts were removed and consumed by the pharaoh and his highest-ranking priests in the belief that this would transfer the victim's life force directly to Egypt's rulers. Other organs were preserved and used in magical preparations, while the remaining flesh was often fed to sacred animals or buried in temple foundations to consecrate new construction projects. Perhaps most horrifying was the Egyptian practice of cascade sacrifice, where the deaths of primary victims were used to justify the killing of their families, friends, and entire communities as additional offerings to ensure the ritual's effectiveness. Palace records from the reign of Thutmose III describe ceremonies where single, sacrificial events resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people, all killed in elaborate sexual tortures designed to maximize their spiritual utility to the Egyptian state. The psychological impact of these sacrificial rituals extended far beyond their immediate victims to create a climate of terror throughout Egyptian society. The knowledge that anyone could be selected for these ceremonies, combined with the detailed public descriptions of what occurred during them, served as a powerful tool for social control that made rebellion against pharaonic authority seem not just futile, but spiritually dangerous. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom period contained detailed descriptions of treatments for individuals who had witnessed sacrificial rituals, including remedies for persistent nightmares, inability to engage in sexual activity, and various forms of mental disturbance that we would now recognize as severe trauma responses. These texts suggest that even witnessing these ceremonies was so psychologically damaging that it required ongoing medical intervention to maintain the mental health of priests and nobles who participated in them. The decline of sacrificial sexual rituals in later periods of Egyptian history appears to have been driven not by moral concerns, but by practical considerations. It's related to resource management and foreign diplomatic pressure. The enormous cost of conducting these ceremonies, combined with increasing contact with foreign civilizations that found them abhorrent, gradually led to their replacement with less extreme forms of ritual sacrifice that still involved sexual elements but did not require the systematic murder of large numbers of people. The sexual practices we've explored in the hidden chambers and forbidden archives of ancient Egypt didn't simply disappear when the last pharaoh fell, and the Roman legions marched along the Nile. Instead, they left a legacy that influenced religious traditions, cultural taboos, and sexual behaviors throughout the ancient world and continues to shape human civilization in ways that most people never realize. Understanding this legacy requires us to examine not just what happened in ancient Egypt, but how those practices spread, evolved, and ultimately contributed to the development of sexual customs and prohibitions that persist to this day. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, his generals and administrators were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the sexual cultures they encountered in the pharaonic courts and temple complexes. Greek accounts from this period, preserved in the Library of Alexandria before its destruction, describe systematic efforts to document Egyptian sexual practices while simultaneously attempting to suppress the most extreme rituals that violated Greek sensibilities about appropriate sexual behavior. However, rather than eliminating these practices entirely, the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death selectively adopted and modified Egyptian sexual customs to serve their own political needs. The Ptolemies continued the pharaonic tradition of divine marriage between siblings. But they also introduced Greek concepts of sexual slavery and prostitution that combined with existing Egyptian practices to create hybrid systems that were arguably more sophisticated and more cruel than either culture had developed independently. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC brought these sexual practices into direct contact with Roman legal and cultural systems, creating tensions that would influence Roman sexual culture for centuries. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius wrote extensively about the sexual practices they encountered in Egypt, describing them as evidence of the decadence and moral corruption that justified Roman imperial expansion. Yet these same historians documented the gradual adoption of Egyptian sexual techniques and customs by Roman emperors and nobles, who found them useful for their own purposes. Archaeological evidence from Roman Egypt reveals the continued operation of temple complexes where Egyptian-style sexual rituals were conducted well into the Christian era. The Temple of Isis at Philae, which remained active until the 6th century AD, contains inscriptions and artwork that clearly depict the continuation of sexual practices that had been developed thousands of years earlier under the pharaohs. These practices were eventually suppressed by Christian authorities, but not before they had influenced the development of early Christian concepts about sexuality, celibacy, and the relationship between spiritual authority and sexual control. Influence of Egyptian sexual practices on early Christianity is particularly evident in the writings of the Desert Fathers, Egyptian monks who developed many of the foundational concepts of Christian monasticism during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. These monks wrote extensively about their struggles with sexual temptation, often describing desires and practices that closely mirror the ritual sexual activities we've examined in pharaonic Egypt. Their development of celibacy as a spiritual discipline can be understood partly as a reaction against the sexual excesses they witnessed in the temples and courts around them. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century AD brought another set of sexual customs and legal frameworks into contact with the remnants of ancient Egyptian practices. Islamic legal scholars struggled with how to address sexual behaviors and institutions that had no equivalent in Arabian culture, ultimately developing new interpretations of Islamic law that incorporated elements of Egyptian practice while attempting to bring them into compliance with Islamic moral standards. Medieval European travelers to Egypt, including crusaders and merchants, encountered sexual practices and institutions that they found both fascinating and disturbing. Their accounts, preserved in monastery libraries and merchant archives throughout Europe, provided detailed descriptions of Egyptian sexual customs that influenced European ideas about Oriental sexuality and contributed to the development of what scholars now recognize as Orientalist sexual fantasies that persisted well into the modern era. The archaeological rediscovery of ancient Egypt during the 18th and 19th centuries brought renewed attention to Egyptian sexual practices, but this time within the context of European colonial expansion and scientific racism. European archaeologists and scholars used evidence of Egyptian sexual practices to justify theories about racial and cultural hierarchy that portrayed ancient Egypt as an example of the sexual degeneracy that resulted from African and Asian influences on civilization. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence of Egyptian sexual practices that earlier generations of scholars either missed entirely or deliberately concealed from public view. Ground-penetrating radar and advanced imaging technologies have identified hidden chambers beneath major temple complexes that contain artifacts and installations related to sexual rituals. Chemical analysis of ancient Egyptian mummies has revealed evidence of sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy complications, and physical trauma that corroborates textual descriptions of the sexual practices we've examined. Perhaps most significantly, modern psychological and sociological research has provided new frameworks for understanding the long-term impact of the systematic sexual exploitation that characterized ancient Egyptian civilization. Studies of trauma transmission across generations suggest that the effects of the sexual practices we've documented may have influenced Egyptian culture and personality development in ways that persisted for centuries after the practices themselves were abandoned. The digital age has created new challenges for scholars studying Egyptian sexual practices. Internet access has made previously restricted archaeological reports and museum collections available to general audiences for the first time. This has led to increased public awareness of aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization that had been carefully hidden from view. But it has also contributed to the spread of sensationalized and inaccurate information that obscures the true historical significance of these practices. Current archaeological projects in Egypt continue to uncover evidence of sexual practices in institutions that expand our understanding of how systematic sexual exploitation operated in ancient civilizations. Recent discoveries at sites like Saqqara and Dashur revealed artifacts and installations that suggest the practices we've examined were even more widespread and sophisticated than previously known, forcing scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian society and culture. The ethical questions raised by this research are complex and ongoing. How should modern scholars present evidence of systematic sexual exploitation without sensationalizing it or contributing to harmful stereotypes about ancient cultures? How can we acknowledge the reality of historical sexual violence while respecting the dignity of its victims? How do we balance the scholarly obligation to document historical truth with the potential social and political consequences of revealing uncomfortable aspects of human civilization? These questions become even more challenging when we consider that the sexual practices of ancient Egypt were not unique aberrations, but part of broader patterns of sexual exploitation that characterized many ancient civilizations and continue to exist in modified forms today. Understanding the Egyptian legacy requires us to confront the uncomfortable reality that systematic sexual exploitation has been a persistent feature of human civilization, one that takes different forms in different eras, but never entirely disappears. In the end, the sexual practices of ancient Egypt serve as a stark reminder that human beings are capable of creating elaborate justifications for treating other human beings as objects to be used for sexual gratification and political control. The pharaohs who ordered these practices, the priests who conducted them, and the nobles who participated in them were not monsters from some alien civilization, but human beings like ourselves who developed systems of sexual exploitation that served their perceived interests while causing immeasurable suffering to their victims. The true horror of the Egyptian legacy lies not in the specific practices we've examined, but in their demonstration that sophisticated, cultured, technologically advanced civilizations are perfectly capable of institutionalizing sexual violence on a massive scale while maintaining the fiction that such practices serve higher moral or spiritual purposes. This lesson remains relevant today as we continue to grapple with institutional sexual abuse, human trafficking, and other forms of systematic sexual exploitation that operate under the cover of religious, political, or cultural authority. As we close these hidden chambers and return from the depths of Egyptian sexual culture to our own time, we carry with us the knowledge that the capacity for both great achievement and terrible cruelty exists within every human civilization. The pharaohs built monuments that still inspire awe thousands of years after their deaths. But they also created systems of sexual exploitation that cause suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Understanding both aspects of their legacy is essential if we hope to learn from history rather than simply repeat its mistakes in new forms.